Hi, I'm Ann Cavera, and I see some familiar faces here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm really excited to talk about this. I know exactly what I want to say. I brought notes because I just can't remember any of it. My son Chris and I, this is Chris, have a more or less weekly, up more. Is that better? Okay. We have a more or less weekly podcast. It's more or less because if something happens like surgery, you know, death in the family, something like that, or I just get tired, we don't record one of those weeks. But so far, we have about 109 episodes. So I'm really proud of that. It's called Speeding Past 80. I write the material, all 5 to 10 minutes of it every week. It's not a big podcast. And Chris records, edits, and posts the podcast. As far as technical stuff, I do nothing. So I'm really grateful to him for that. In fact, I knew nothing about podcasts at all for quite some time. But then my husband, Jim, had Alzheimer's we noticed things about 2015. He was diagnosed in 2017. And by the time COVID came along, about 2019, we were pretty much homebound. And by the time COVID was over, we were homebound. And I think, like most caregivers, I had some depression. And even though I had wonderful support from family and friends, it was lonely because most of the time it was just the two of us there at home. And I'm sure some of you can relate. Well, Jim could no longer even carry on a conversation. And so I wondered what I could do. How could I combat the depression and loneliness? And then here came my 80th birthday. That was even more depressing because we couldn't go to Ireland. We couldn't go to Hawaii. We couldn't go to Myers. What are you going to do? Well, I think our generation is really very good at taking stock of what you have and then trying to figure out how you can use what you have to get out of whatever fix you're in. So that's what I did. I took stock of what I had. For a number of years, Jim and I had written a column for our church paper. We had written it for 14 years, a weekly column. And I had more than 700 of these little family stories. And then I discovered I had a son that was not only tech savvy, which I already knew, but he's a professor at BGSU, and he actually taught podcasting at that time. So I said, I've got material. I've got a son that teaches podcasting. What can we do here? And I thought, well, I'll have a podcast. And I asked Chris if he would handle the technical stuff. And bless his heart, he said yes. He has faithfully recorded, edited, and posted every single one of those 109 episodes. Thank you, Chris.
Welcome.
Okay, so like MacGyver, I thought I had a way out of the jam. I would just record these every week. And so we began. Most podcast episodes are like 20 or 30 minutes long. Mine are really only 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 12. If I interview someone, which I sometimes do, those podcasts are about 20 minutes. And we'll talk more about interviewing later. Well, Jim passed away last November, and it had been a long struggle. And I'm grateful he's at peace. If you've lost a spouse, you miss them every day. And then I thought about giving up the podcast. After all, it had served its purpose. But something interesting happened. I didn't want to give it up because I had come to value the people who listened. And I had Chris run statistics now and then. He ran them the other day. And I have listeners not only in this country. Now, I don't have a huge amount of listeners, but I do have listeners. And I have listeners in Canada.
Yeah.
I have listeners in Japan, Kenya. A wonderful man who teaches at an agricultural college in Kenya is a listener, and he's become a friend. The United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands. And I value every one of them, even though I only know a couple of them by face. The one in Canada is especially important to me. She is a woman, let's say, of seasoned years, and she is a photographer who travels all over the world alone. And she records people's stories and she takes their pictures. And she sent me some of her materials. You can look at this later. This is a picture she took in West Africa. She does beautiful work, and I've interviewed her for Speeding Past 80, and I probably will again. Anyway, she goes by the professional name of Magnolia Stone. I think that's a great name. So I found that I really did not want to give up my podcast. Chris agreed to continue. And here we are in the middle of our third year. So that's a little about us. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about all of you. How many of you listen to podcasts? Oh, that's a good number. Anybody have a favorite podcast they would share? Just the name of it?
Joe and Nick's Road Trip.
Road Trip? Joe and Nick's Road Trip. What's that about? Oh, don't let me catch you in the middle of lunch. We'll talk later. Anybody else? Okay. Until I asked Chris if he'd help me do a podcast, I'd never heard a podcast. And I still don't listen to a lot of them, though I do have a couple of favorites. Okay. Anyone in here hoping to start a podcast? Okay. That's good. Two or three or four people. We're going to talk a little bit about what you need to do to start a podcast too. So what's a podcast? Well, it's like radio, only it's better. How many people remember radio? How many people remember the Lone Ranger? Okay. So I want you to take a trip back with me to 1949. Some of you may have to imagine 1949. I can actually remember 1949. I was 7 years old. My favorite radio program was The Lone Ranger. And naturally, that came on at 7:30 at night, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But somehow we were living in Charleston, and I think it came on in the afternoon where we were. And for the sake of our story, let's imagine that we're all sitting in front of the radio at 3:30 on Friday afternoon, except for one sweet child who's with his mother in the grocery store. And it's 3:15. And he can see he's not going to be home at 3:30 in time to hear the Lone Ranger. And he's getting really, really anxious. Well, he tries to tug on his mom's arm, and she pays no attention to him because she's busy trying to decide whether to buy a pound of ground beef at 49 cents a pound or a hen at 47 cents a pound for Sunday dinner. He knows there's no way he's going to get back in time for the Lone Ranger because she's going to go up to the checkout counter and talk to the girl up there for about 20 minutes while she's checking out. Well, by the time Mama decides just to buy perch at 33 cents a pound and have that for Sunday dinner, and she gets through the checkout, they get home at 4:05 p.m. and he has missed the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger has already caught the bad guys and hi-hoed Silvered out of there until next week. That leaves him with nothing. Well, with podcasts, that wouldn't be a problem. Today, a 7-year-old would be with his mom in the grocery store, and he's not worried about the Lone Ranger. He's got umpteen dozen things on this little thing in his hands, and he's following her along. And he doesn't care how long she stays there. Or he could be at ball practice. Is this working right? Okay. Or he could be at ball practice and he could listen to his stories or his whatever. podcasts. I think there are podcasts for kids too. You could listen to those that night or even the next day. In fact, you can listen to your favorite podcast over and over. Another good thing about podcasts is it leaves our hands free to do anything else we want. Fix dinner, clean a room, work in the garage, mow the lawn. You can still listen to something on a podcast. They don't require the same attention as watching a movie or television. So if you want to hear part of an episode or a whole episode again, you just run it again. So how do you find a podcast that you'd like to hear? Does anybody here have a particular interest in a topic? What interests you? A hobby or something? Anybody have a hobby? Okay, what do you have? Who said, oh yeah?
Junk journals.
I'm sorry?
Junk journals. I make
Sure. Oh, you make journals. Wonderful.
out of
Dust?
out of junk.
Yeah.
What? Paper, cardboard, all sorts of things. I make journals.
That's fascinating. You should be up here one day. Yes. So you make journals out of junk? What kind of junk?
Cardboard, construction paper, any kind of paper. You can go farther than that and make, transform your paper like tea dyeing. And then you put it all together, and those junk journals they are journals that you can use to write in, but they also have things to read, things to just look at. You can put whatever you want in them. Some of mine are covered with fabric, some aren't. The sky's the limit. It's your imagination.
What do you do with those?
Myself,
Uh-huh.
because I enjoy it. But it's difficult to sell because, as you just saw, you have to explain what they are. On them. Some I've seen on Etsy are selling for hundreds of dollars.
Oh my goodness.
But it's a work of art. So they put all sorts of wonderful things in them. I mean, you can insert all sorts of things.
Do you sell these online? Do you sell them at Etsy?
I'm,
Mm.
I only have about 20, and I'm done with this. Is something I've spent a year and a half doing,
Mhm.
and I enjoyed it, and I learned a lot of techniques. But I'm past that. I want to go back to sewing and painting, and I do all sorts of craft, but I spent the last year and a half doing junk journals, and it's fascinating.
Oh, that's wonderful. You need to talk to
I
her.
know, I'm gonna find
Yeah.
her. I know where she is.
Oh. Okay, suppose you have an interest in journals or gardening or football or anything. You can find anything. How do you find podcasts that might interest you? Okay, I don't think we're going to put it up here, are we? Okay, okay, go ahead. Oh,
Do we have to?
Apple Podcast.
Yeah.
yes, Apple Podcast. You can go to Apple Podcast and it will bring up all kinds of things. What I do is I go to the search bar at the top and I put in podcast, top 10, and then whatever topic I want to find out about. So podcast top 10, but you can go to Apple or Spotify. There are a lot of podcasts. And then it will give you a list. A list will come up on your computer of the top 10. Well, I usually don't do the top 1 or 2 or 3 because they want you to subscribe. And that's a problem for me because I don't know about subscribing, and I've tried it before and I end up with all kinds of things in my inbox. So I go down the list to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 in the top 10, and I click on those. They don't want you to subscribe. They just want listeners. So that's what I do. I just put in podcast, top 10, and then whatever topic I want. And some of those are on Apple or Spotify or some other platforms too. Okay, that's how you access it. Now, For those of you who are thinking about starting a podcast, and there are 2 or 3, not much is required in the way of money for a startup. I think I invested about $150 in a good microphone. But a good microphone that we use for recording. Chris brings his computer over. He sets up my microphone. He sets up the computer. He points at me. I talk. I finish. He covers up the computer, goes home and fixes it. And that's how we do it. Now, if you have some tech skills or you're willing to learn some tech skills, I'm told it's relatively easy to start a podcast. Currently, there are more than 3 million podcasts on any topic you can imagine. However, one statistic says that only 156,000 of those 3 million podcasts have more than 10 episodes. And the reason for that is it's much easier to start a podcast than it is to keep it going. So. The number 1 podcast in the world is called the Joe Rogan Experience. How many of you listen to Joe Rogan? Okay, 2. You notice my hand's not up. I pulled it up. I was going to listen before I came. You got to subscribe. That's a problem for me. So I didn't. Over the years, now he started his podcast in 2009. Over the years, he has had a total of 3 billion downloads. Now, he has sponsors and advertisers that pay him a lot of money to be advertised on his podcast. Some of his podcasts go 1 hour, 2 hours, something like that. And he has guests. And he's net worth over $200 million. I do not make any money from my podcast, and I am not likely to ever make any money from my podcast, and that's okay.
What does he talk about?
What do I talk about?
What does he talk?
I think he just has like a free range experience with guests that show up. Is that right?
He'll have the guy, he'll have a lot of different people called together. He'll have the Hancock guy that believes that things happened 50,000 years ago.
Oh,
Some of them are real strange, some of them are a little bizarre. He'll talk to people that have gone, that use certain drugs, stuff about their drug experience.
well.
You never know one day whether you want to listen to them.
Mhm. Well, Chris? Okay.
The Joe Rogan Experience is an example of a one-on-one interview. So there's a couple different styles of podcasts out there. The one-on-one interview, you could also have a panel discussion where it's a host with maybe 5 or 6 people. And those tend to go on for an hour at least because everybody wants to talk, right? Another type of podcast that you might not have written in there is fictional narrative, right? And a fictional narrative podcast may only have 10 episodes, but it's sort of a complete series, sort of like a radio show. Like I used to listen to a radio show called The Shadow from, I don't know, 50s maybe. This was before podcasts were a thing. I would listen to radio shows, just old radio shows, go out on a jog, listen to an episode of The Shadow. But that would be an example of fictional narrative, right? A radio play. And those are still very much, they've been rediscovered recently with the popularization of podcasts. So Joe Rogan has a one-on-one interview style podcast. Speeding Past 80 is just this one person show, right? And then, but then you also have fictional narrative podcasts, which can be a lot of fun too. So those would be like your old radio plays. And then there's also repurposed content. So you could listen to a podcast that's just old speeches, old political speeches, just sort of there for you to hear again, if you want to. So there's a lot of different sort of styles of podcasts out there. And if you want to do a podcast, it's important to think about what style works best for what kind of message you want to get.
There's a lot of crime, like crime.
Yeah, true crime podcast.
True crime, they'll take some
Mm.
serial killer and they'll go over the whole.
Yeah,
Those are sort of fascinating.
No sleep at night.
yeah.
No, these are actual crimes and they go in and talk to you about those crimes. And the hard history is a big one. By Jane Carlin is a big one about history. If you want to do that, I use those to go to sleep because they just put you to sleep.
You know, the good thing I think about listening to podcasts too, is that one of the things I found being at home with Jim is I did not have a lot of things to talk about when I went out in public with other people. You know, they were living their lives. There was a mainstream going on. And I really just didn't want to talk about illness all the time. But you know, a podcast gives you, especially ones that are connected to your interests, gives you something other than your daily life to talk about. It helps you make connections with other people. And if you want to start a podcast, the first question I think I would ask is, why? Why do you want to do that? I think there are 4 reasons. The first is connect with others. And that's what I wanted. I was just looking for connection. I wanted to just say what I wanted to say. I don't have a brand. I don't have a theme. And I've been told that's all wrong. You got to have a brand and a theme. And I'm sure that's true. But if I get up and I just want to say something, that's what I talk about. And it's a relief to be able to do that. And then legacy. You know, I have 4 grandkids. Chris has 2 sets of twins. Yes. The girls are 20 and the boys are 16. And there are things I want to tell those kids, things that I think are important. But have you ever tried to sit maybe a grandchild down and say, I want to tell you things that are important about how to buy a house or how to buy a car or what to look for in a husband or a wife? Well, if you've ever tried that, how'd it go for you? But you know, I can tell stories on my podcast and I can wrap into these stories some of the deeper things in life I would really like to share with the grandkids. Are they listening? I don't think they listen too often unless it's about one of them. And then they will listen, or you know, maybe they do listen sometimes. That's okay. After I'm dead and gone and they've got kids, they'll realize how wise I was. They will sit those kids down and make them listen.
I started a blog for my grandchildren. And I've got about 20 stories now with pictures. I started with, you know, and then I just kind of went forward with different stories. Some of them love it. Some of them don't even look at it.
Yes.
My husband died young and there's so much they don't remember. So, you know, it seems like I remember a lot of things. So, I want to share that with them, and after I'm gone, the ones that didn't want to look at it, it'll be there if they want.
Yes, and you never know how far reach that might have. And we're actually going to talk about other ways to share who we are than a podcast at the very end. And that's one of them. And I think it's so important to realize that you have something you want to do. There's more than one way to do it. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry.
I use a free website called Twit.
Oh, okay, for your blog.
One of the one of the program. One of the professors put me on that because he posted all his books and his stuff.
Oh, that's good to know. WIX. Good. I may remember that myself. Rita?
It's a website that you go to and you have your own, you'll have your own name, you know, that you can go to it. Mine's called Grandma's Memory.
That's nice. That's nice.
Why don't you let them know, I have only let my grandchildren know,
Mhm.
I have a lot of
That's good.
great grandchildren, and now
Yes.
my first two great grades.
Oh, my goodness.
So every time I post something new, I let them know there's something new out there.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, connecting with others, leaving a legacy, and you may just have a passionate interest in something, maybe World War II, maybe bowling, I don't know. And it would do your heart good just to be able to talk to people about what you're interested in. And if you begin doing that, you'll find other people who are also interested in what you're interested in will listen, and you'll gather a circle of like-minded people. Well, here's the truth. At our age, we just like to be heard. We know important stuff. We could save people time and trouble if they'd listen to us. And they're not likely to listen, but we can still get them. There's another inner motivation. Oh, some people try to start a podcast to make money. That's the worst reason to start a podcast. Most of us do not make any money. And you have to do it because you love it. You love sharing. Another reason is we're motivated to share some less tangible things. And I touched on this a moment ago. At the age we are now, we feel an enormous amount of love for family and friends. We feel an enormous amount of gratitude for life. And when you have a heart full of love and gratitude, that needs to be shared. It's difficult to tell the people who are important to us how much we love them. And if we want to share the deeper meanings of life, like faith, hope, and love, a podcast lets us think about our thoughts before we share them. It lets us think about what's meaningful and true. And then it gives us the way to send our love and gratitude out into the world, wrapped in a story. If your podcast is about basketball, traveling, if your passion is for anything that you have a passion for, your love and your gratitude can shine through your topic to your listeners. So what do you do for material? Well, one of the easiest ways I found to generate material is to interview writers. I write, and it has done my heart good to interview other writers. Interviews usually go about 20 minutes for me. This is an enjoyable way to come up with material because all I have to do is Google the person I want to interview, research them, and then come up with a list of questions, which I usually share with the person I'm interviewing ahead of time. This had a remarkable effect on what I was trying to do. Another thing I did while Jim was in the last years of his life, I dug out a project I had had for a long time and had not finished. Anybody here have unfinished projects?
Oh.
All right. I started a book. I taught middle school reading. I started a book for middle school readers 40 some years ago. And it sat in a drawer. Every now and then I'd take it out, polish it up, send it off, it'd come back. And there it was. Well, I asked myself while Jim was ill, what do I really want to do? And you know, that book called my name again. And so I dug it out. I started going to online writers' conferences, and I began meeting people through those. And last year, Elk Lake Publishing gave me a contract, and they published the book this past March. So, you know, if you've ever heard, if people tell you you're too old to write, no, you're not. You can write at any age. So one of my interviews had been with an author by the name of Glennis Nellis. She's a wonderful author, and I would interview her when she'd have a new book coming out. She's got about 40 books now, picture books, but they're lovely. And so I was telling her that Elk Lake had given me a contract for my book. And she said, I will endorse it. I don't know anybody who'd endorse my book. And she says, and I know people and they will endorse it too. And she was as good as her word. And she was able to get me 3 or 4 endorsements from wonderful authors. But see, that was just because I had that little connection. And this is what little connections do. They sometimes lead you in unexpected places. You can also talk about material that you already know, your interest. For instance, some people think I make a pretty good sweet roll, the caramel kind with the pecans on top. Now, if I were going to have a podcast about sweet rolls, caramel sweet rolls, that would only work for less than 10 episodes. But if I were to have a podcast about baking, say baking bread, I could interview bread bakers. I could share recipes. I could go to bakeries and eat the goods online right there. So if you have an interest and it may not be big enough for a podcast, expand it a little bit. What is this interest connected to that might make a podcast? I have a wonderful online friend named Paula Chamberlain, and she's been podcasting for about 5 years now. She's seasoned like the rest of us. And she has a passion for quilting. Any quilters in here? Okay. Paula has a podcast called The Quilter's Way. And I think she has maybe more than a couple of hundred episodes now. But she interviews quilters from all over the world. She interviews, I think one was with a quilter in South America not long ago. And she also interviewed a quilter who's still at work at more than 100 years old. She goes to quilting shows and she'll interview people at quilting shows. She's really lively and her podcast is lovely. If you get a chance, listen to The Quilter's Way. She's really good. Okay. What about family stories? Yes.
Don't know anything about them. So are they, are any of them like, where it's visual?
Yes, some podcasts, in fact, more and more visual. Well, I think it's still mostly listening, but visual podcasts are becoming more and more popular. Now, Chris tried to help me start a YouTube channel a few years ago, and I did. I had a few episodes, and when I saw how old and ugly I was, there was no way, no way. I said, we're not doing that. And so I like my podcast to be audio because I think audio gives me the opportunity to sound younger and more energetic than people might guess. But yes, I think Joe Rogan Experience is visual, isn't it? So you can either do it visual or audio. Is that correct? Okay. Yes.
You said that you get feedback, from some of yours. They can't interact while they're listening. Is that right? And
No.
then they text you or what?
Here's what has often happened. If someone is listening, they will, I think they go to either my website or my Facebook page. They'll go to my Facebook page and send me a friend request. I accept their friend request after I vetted them. I go to their website or their Facebook page and I see if they sound legit to me. I don't ever accept friend requests from some 60-year-old widow who looks like he's the brother of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Don't accept those, but I will see if they're legitimate. And if they are legitimate, I friend them back. And then maybe they'll send me a private message, and I will private message them back. And that's happened several times. I don't know how to access comments on Apple or Spotify. I think there's been 1 or 2 on Apple, but I don't know how to do that. I am what I am. I'm doing the best I can with what I have. So, it just has to be that way. But I have connected with a lot of people that way. Now, Marjorie Stone was that way. She friended me. I friended her back. She told me a little a little bit about herself, and I interviewed her. And we have stayed friends on Facebook. And I think she has my email now. We've emailed back and forth. Okay. I think we covered family stories. So what do you really need to have if you're going to create a podcast? First, you have to be someone with an abundance of curiosity and interest in other people. It can't be a self-serving thing. You might already know a lot about your topic, or maybe you just want to find out more and share what you find out with people. That's good too. I just talk about whatever I want to talk about. I often talk about my faith. I talk about what's happened in my daily life. With permission, I talk about my grandkids. I ask their permission first. It's a good thing to do that. I did do a few podcasts about Jim's Alzheimer's, but I didn't want my podcast to be just about Jim's illness. So if you go back, you can see a few podcasts about his illness. Here's an example of a podcast from a couple of weeks ago. It was based on an experience my grandson had last week. And we'll probably wrap it up quickly after this. I don't know how long I'm supposed to go here.
We have an hour, yeah, that's not working, so
Okay.
we have 15 minutes.
Okay, let me read this. This is the good thing about audio visual podcast. I know what I want to say. I sit down, I think through it, I get it just the way I want to say it, but nobody can see that I'm reading it on the podcast. Because once again, I might start out saying something and then my brain goes on a different tangent. And then where does that leave me? So I write this out, and this is a true story. This happened to my grandson a couple of weeks ago, and this was our podcast. I think it's number 108. And we're also going to do a podcast here. We're going to record one here next week. Okay. Sit down for this. I had hip replacement surgery last week, and I'm not doing really 100% yet.
Looking great.
Well,
Last month, okay. I was like, wait a minute.
Okay, can you hear me? Did you ever notice how many new beginnings happen in the summer? Our grandsons are now 16. Both have recently started part-time jobs. David's working at a local fast food restaurant, and he's learning to deal directly with customers. He's been surprised at how rude customers behaving in ways his parents would not allow. All right, now see, that sentence was kind of jumbled. Hold it up. Okay. Chris takes that home and he gets rid of that. And he makes it sound like this. David's been surprised by rude customers behaving in ways his parents would never allow. David's also juggling his part-time job with band camp, where he and his bandmates spend days and days learning a new halftime show for this fall. Grandson Jamie mowed lawns for 2 years and saved his money to buy a car of his own. He realized his dream a few weeks ago and is now the proud owner of a 14-year-old vehicle that has already clocked 248,000 miles. Anybody have one of those cars like that in your past?
Right now.
So far, thankfully, his car runs just fine, and he's rightfully proud of his accomplishment. The big shock to Jamie is how often the gas tank has to be filled and how much gas costs. Gas requires money. Money requires work. So now Jamie's bagging groceries at the local Kroger. And this brings us to our story for this week. By the way, I have Jamie's permission to share his story with you. A couple of days ago, Jamie drove to his new job, and as instructed by the management, he parked his car far out on the lot so customers could have the spaces closer to the store. Now, to protect his prized possession, he carefully parked his car with 5 empty spaces on either side. See, when I do this and we're recording, Chris just gets rid of the pauses. Then, confident his pride and joy would be safe, Jamie went to work on a bright, sunny morning. After bagging groceries for a few hours, his turn came up to bring carts in from the lot. But the weather had swiftly changed. Now dark wind-blown clouds were rushing across the sky. Well, the store does not allow workers to clear the lot if there's lightning, but there was no hint of thunder or lightning. So outdoors Jamie went, just as the storm broke. With such force, rain was hitting his face sideways. Legs pumping, pushing a huge line of carts, he dodged wind-blown stray papers and empty bottles. Jamie persevered until he had the cart safely under cover. That should be the end of the story, but it isn't. You know those electric carts used by shoppers with mobility issues? Well, a couple of those carts were still out on the lot. And yep, Jamie had to go back out and get those too. At last, only one motorized cart remained. Did I mention that Jamie at age 16 is thin and tall? With the rain and wind pounding, he managed to wedge his 6'5" frame into the cart. He pushed the engine. You'd fix that, wouldn't you? He pushed the ignition only to find the battery barely alive. Hunched over the steering wheel with his legs bent like a giant grasshopper, he pointed that cart toward the store. Inch by agonizing inch, he rode that cart through the tempest, wondering if he might reach the store before nightfall. After a painfully long, slow ride, he and the cart were both safely inside. That should have been the end of the story. But as the old infomercials used to say, wait, there's more. Soaked to the bone, Jamie glanced back at the lot from inside the store. And when he did, a look of disbelief crossed his face. Far, far, far out on the lot, a lone, empty grocery cart caught his eye. Driven by the wind and rain, this cart barreled faster and faster across the lot, as if aiming straight for his new car. With no time to react, Jamie watched horrified as the cart slammed into his pride and joy. Well, thankfully, Jamie's shift ended a few minutes later. The rain still poured. I don't know if the car was damaged or not. The car was already in such a state, who would know? As he trudged across the parking lot and hurried home to safety, the last indignity was he heard the wail of the tornado siren in the distance. Jamie and I laughed about his adventure the next day, but I can't help but think of all the people out there who bravely make new beginnings by starting at the bottom where workers struggle to get the job done, even in the middle of raging storms. And then, even after mighty effort to finish the job, empty carts still smash into their pride and joy. Sometimes, even when we think a situation can't get any worse, sure enough, it can and does. So here's to all the kids hauling carts in off of lots, and to the thousands of kids dealing with rude customers, and to the marching band kids on hot pavement learning a brand new show. See, Chris will fix this little pause. Here's to the kids in freshman dorms on distant campuses. In fact, here's to anyone beginning at the bottom. There really is something noble, good, and hopeful about starting on the lowest rung of the ladder. So, if you're on the bottom rung, think of all those upward possibilities waiting above you. Remember, you were created for a purpose. Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, knew a great deal about being in tough situations. Here's what God told him in one of the most often quoted verses from the Bible. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So even if at the moment a storm rages around you and all you can do is hang on, persevere, don't let go, because wait, there's more. Thanks for listening. This is Ann Cavera with Speeding Past 80. Now, I brought some things to pass out.